those who accept Muhammad's religion and pray his prayers would be relieved of taxes.
That's a nice conversion strategy.
Absolutely. One of the most effective in history. So convert to Islam, you don't have to pay tax.
Yeah. Where do I sign?
Yeah.
Allahu Akbar.
I think I'd do the same.
I'm in, baby.
Many of us would. And so the conquered people were given, these were Zoroastrians, they were made to pay a poll tax known as jizya. But again, those who converted to Islam were exempted from it. And even those who did not convert were not badly treated as long as they paid up. But if you failed to pay up, you were either enslaved or killed. So you were given a choice: death, taxes, or Islam. And of course, many chose Islam.
Welcome back to another episode of CypherPunk'd. We're here for our third episode in the series about daylight robbery, and I'm here with my buddy, Dominic Frisby.
Hello, sir. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
So today, we're going to talk about Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and tax. And I know we kind of talked about it a little bit in some previous episodes, but we're going to double click and go deep into down those rabbit holes today.
Sure. And we talked about how you design a society the way you tax it, and how the destiny of a society is determined by the way it's taxed. And we also talked about how old taxation is, older than civilization itself. And that tax is power and tax is a form of rule. Mm-hmm. And how there is also a tax story behind pretty much everything, often an untold one. And so I'll do a little game with you, Matty. Just before we talk about religion, and there's a tax story behind every religion. And because religion was a form of control, a form of guidance, a form of
Coordination.
It was the media before we had media. You know, if eating pigs is bad for your health, well, make it a sin. And that's a good way to get the word out that you shouldn't eat pigs, or whatever that you shouldn't kill people and that you shouldn't steal and so on. So religion was, in a funny kind of way, prayer has been replaced by mass media. And I think I read a book about habits a few years ago, not Atomic Habits, it was another one. And willpower. And the author argued that religious people tend to be more successful than non-religious people. And he attributed that to habits. And those habits are often because if you're religious, you're often part of a religious community, and there's a lot of monitoring going on, and you feel you owe that community, and so you have an obligation to behave responsibly and behave in a good way. And if you behave according to these patterns, you tend to achieve more. And so, anyway, the question I want to ask you, I'll just play a little game with you. But this idea that there's a tax story behind every great event in history, just off the top of your head, give me shout out an event from history, and I'll attempt to tell you the tax story.
The World War I.
Okay, well, every war in history was paid for by some kind of tax, and so that's war. Tax enables war, and that will do for that one.
Yeah, I think the world wars are near and dear to our hearts as Bitcoiners, if you really look at the underlying incentives and stuff around all that.
Absolutely, and it was the beginning of the end of Britain as an international. I mean, the speed at which Britain, like the peak of the British Empire, was probably about 1911, something like that. Just a couple of years before World War I, and we really were, the greatest nation on earth. And the speed at which we have vacated that position is something to behold.
Yeah.
Go on, give us another one.
Another one. Let's do. Trying to think here.
The Titanic.
The Titanic. That's an interesting one. I don't know if
the sinking of the Titanic. That is a wild one. And I'd like to say that the Titanic was built with taxpayers' money, but I don't think it was. And I think that is a rare, I mean, it was going from one nation to another, but I think that is a rare occurrence that doesn't involve taxation. And in fact, the one kind of category that doesn't involve taxation is natural disasters. And you could say that the sinking of the Titanic, because it went into an iceberg, was a kind of a natural disaster. And, you might say the tsunami in Indonesia, the famous tsunami shortly after the turn of the century, 2005, 2006, whenever it was, that was a natural disaster. The hurricane that took out South Carolina late last year, natural disaster. Where the tax story comes in, the plague, the Black Death, another natural disaster. Where the tax story comes in is in the rebuilding effort afterwards. And normally that involves a huge amount of taxpayers' money. And I don't actually know about who paid for the rescue effort of the Titanic, but I imagine it was the taxpayer. I'm as sure as
Let's find out
that the rescue effort was the taxpayer.
Let's chime in Grok here. Let's see if...
I don't even know if Grok's going to know, because all Grok does, all the
just ask
AIs, they trawl the internet, and you find these questions are not readily available on the internet. A lot of the time you have to deduce. And this is why tax is such an important thing, is the, who paid for this in 1863? It's just not recorded. You just have to sort of deduce it, and that's an example of how this is an untold story.
Okay, so
but natural disasters, it's the rebuilding effort afterwards. The Great Fire of London. One theory is that it came from people dodging their hearth tax.
Yeah, this
that
is what I wanted to talk about. Yeah,
you would knock through to the fire next door and use their chimney, and it's thought, and that did lead to fires. But really? the Great Fire of London, but let's just assume it was an accident in a baker's. But the London was rebuilt on the proceeds of a coal tax imposed by Charles II afterwards, and so that's where that's the tax angle in natural disasters.
Fascinating. It looks like with the Titanic, there was like it was in international waters, so there was ships that responded to the emergency call. But I think I did see there, although most of the funds weren't from taxpayers, there was like organizations and things set up that involved some public resources to help the families or help people.
Absolutely, and some of those ships that came would have been national ships, and some of them would have been privately. But the majority of that rebuilding, they would have sought some compensation, and there would have been a huge taxpayer spend at some stage in the salvaging and the life saving. So let's start with this idea that there's a tax story behind every great religion. And here's a question for you that I like. We noticed that the original handwriting came about as a result of a way of recording debts owed, which the majority of which were taxes. And so the people who mastered this new art of writing, the scribes, would become the tax collectors. But of the plethora of religions that existed in the Middle East, several hundred years before Christ or thousands of years before Christ, and in North Africa, there were hundreds of religions. Why did Judaism survive and none of the others?
That's a great question.
Is it because the Jews were the chosen people?
I think their story definitely survived the test of time.
That's their angle on it. The reason is they wrote theirs down.
They wrote it down, yeah.
And
speaking of which, what we didn't talk about last chapter, which was the Rosetta Stone.
Sure.
We didn't touch on that, so
we'll talk about the Rosetta Stone. We can talk about that in a sec. And then you wonder why Christianity replaced all the pagan religions and the Celtic religions of Northern Europe as Christianity spread north in the Dark Ages. And again, it's because all those pagan religions were passed on orally, and Christianity was written down. And it's one of the reasons that Christianity replaced all the religions in South America and across Africa largely as well. The Christianity was written down. And we've already discussed this relationship between handwriting and taxation.
The Christians were smart. I mean, they adopted a lot of the pagan holidays.
They did.
Built it into the whole story. I mean, that was fascinating.
Christmas.
like Christmas, for example.
Midwinter
It's just
solstice
like
and
the
all that.
winter solstice of the
Yeah.
pagans, and they just say, "Oh, this is
Yeah.
Jesus' birthday or whatever."
Absolutely. But it's, it's a tactic that's worked many times through history and will continue to work. So but the most famous incidents of Jewish people writing down their religion came with Moses and the Ten Commandments. And by about 1300 BC, the Jewish people had been in Egypt for, several hundred years, 400 or 500 years. But their growing wealth, their prosperity created a certain amount of resentment. They were reproducing. They were seen as a threat. And the Egyptians, to use the words of the Bible, became ill-affected towards the Hebrews. And Titus Josephus, who was a Jewish historian, said that they were touched with envy at their prosperity.
Sounds familiar.
A Hebrew historian. And the words of the Bible, behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. That's what the Pharaoh said. Let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply. And so to deal wisely with them was to tax them. And there's a chap called Heinrich Gretz who wrote The History of the Jews, and he explains that at that time, you could only be enslaved if you were a prisoner of war or a criminal, or if you had failed to pay your debts or taxes. And so the oppression began with taxation. And this is not the first time in Jewish history that this has happened. It's how the Nazis began the persecution of the Jewish people as well. And in fact, not just the Jewish people, but persecution of any people often starts through the tax system.
Yeah.
And taxes were increased to punitive levels. And to use the words of the Bible again, as the Egyptians set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens. And it was escalated. And it made the children of Israel serve with rigor. They made their lives bitter with hard bondage in mortar and in brick and in all manner of service in the field. And by the time that Moses led them out of Egypt, the once free Hebrews had become slaves. Slavery, which you have no ownership of your labor, your entire self, it's the ultimate form of taxation. And so Moses led them into the Sinai, and to escape their bondage, maybe they were history's first tax exiles. There were probably earlier tax exiles than that. But anyway, let's call them history's first tax exiles. And from there, we have the Ten Commandments, the belief system on which Judaism and indeed Christianity is built. So founding story, tax story.
Fascinating.
And then, of course, we have Christianity. And we've already talked about how it came to pass that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And all went to be taxed, everyone into his own city. And Joseph also went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth into Judea unto the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, to be taxed with Mary, his espoused wife, being great with child. They were only in Bethlehem to pay taxes. And tax is a recurring theme throughout Jesus' life. And he was a revolutionary. And if you look at many great revolutionaries, rebels, they were usually tax rebels. Spartacus, Robin Hood, Boadicea, Mahatma Gandhi. They were all tax rebels. And he complained about this, but he complained that the Romans taxed some religions, but not their own. What the Romans did. They tolerated other religions, but they taxed them.
The classic
but
temple tax.
He still said that we should pay up lest we should offend them. So he recommended that his people pay their taxes because the consequences of not paying them were not worth it.
So if you worshipped the Roman pantheon of gods, you did not have to pay the tax. But if you were a Jew or a Christian or whatever, Christianity didn't even exist at the time. So if you were a Jew or if you were some other form of pagan, you had to pay the temple tax.
Yeah, precisely. And there's a famous story of Jesus and the Pharisees, and he went inside the temple of Jerusalem and found traders at work, and he began to cast them out, and he was horrified.
So when you say this is what I was confused about. You said traders, you mean like what do you mean?
People
by
buying and selling stuff, merchants.
Oh, inside the
temple.
Okay, gotcha.
And he didn't like it.
Gotcha. Okay.
And so he cast them out.
Okay.
And of course, the Pharisees and their scribes were horrified because their business had been disrupted, and the revenues they collected for Pontius Pilate, the man responsible for collecting taxes in Judea on behalf of Rome, and their relationship with him was prejudiced because they couldn't collect their taxes and pay him. And so they wanted to get rid of this problematic figure. And so they tried to trick him into incriminating himself. They wanted to trap him in his words. And so they flattered him, they praised him, and then they asked him whether it was right for Jews to pay the taxes demanded by Caesar, hoping that he would say that it wasn't right. And then they would have a reason to hand him over to Pontius Pilate. And they sent spies, Luke tells us, who pretended to be righteous that they might seize on his words in order to deliver him to the power and the authority of the governor. But he knew what they were doing. "Why do you test me, you hypocrites?" he said. "Show me the tax money." One of them showed him a denarius, the Roman coin, the silver coin. By the way, it was 20 denarii with the 20 silver coins that Judas betrayed Caesar with. "And whose image and inscription is this?" And they replied, "Caesar's," to which he uttered the immortal line, "Render therefore to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And that's one of Jesus's great lines.
Yeah, famous quote.
He got away with it on that occasion.
That time, apparently.
But eventually, the crime for which he was crucified was
sedition.
And Roman citizens couldn't be crucified, only non-Romans. And they're for 3 crimes: attempting to escape from slavery, highway robbery, or piracy and sedition. "We found this fellow perverting the nation," cried the mob who brought Jesus before Pontius Pilate, "and forbidding to give tribute," i.e. tax, "to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ a king." Now, Roman tolerated other religions, but it would not tolerate other kings because it was a threat to their tax revenue. And sedition, which he encouraged by non-payment of taxes.
So he did eventually say, "Don't pay your taxes." That's kind of what happened.
He is forbidding to give tribute to Caesar later on.
Okay.
And so at the birth of Christ, throughout his story, at his death, there is a tax story.
Fascinating.
And there is a tax story at the heart of Islam as well. One of the best tax stories of the lot. And so Islam began with the Prophet Muhammad and in the 7th century, and it kind of Byzantium and the Sasanian Empire were just exhausted by this point. Rome had already gone. Byzantium was the new Rome, but they were just fighting, conquering. They were exhausted. Within 3 decades of the death of Muhammad, Islam was one of the world's largest empires. It controlled the whole of North Africa, the Middle East. How did it spread so quickly? Once you understand Muslim tax policy, you understand all. And so the first caliph was Abu Bakr, who was Muhammad's father-in-law and his close companion. And what they would do is, they're like the armies of the Roman Republic were volunteers. Conscription only came later, but voluntarism works. And they were rewarded with, when they conquered a country, they were obviously, rewarded with loot and plunder and all the rest of it. And they believed in their mission. But when they first took the Sasanian Empire, which would be that part of the Middle East, Iran and so on, he declared that those who accept Muhammad's religion and pray his prayers would be relieved of taxes.
That's a nice conversion strategy.
Absolutely. One of the most effective in history. So convert to Islam, you don't have to pay tax.
Yeah. Where do I sign?
Yeah.
Allahu Akbar.
I think I'd do the same.
I'm in, baby.
Many of us would. And so the conquered people were given, these were Zoroastrians, they were made to pay a poll tax known as jizya. But again, those who converted to Islam were exempted from it. And even those who did not convert were not badly treated as long as they paid up. But if you failed to pay up, you were either enslaved or killed. So you were given a choice: death, taxes, or Islam. And of course, many chose Islam. And Bakr's successors all followed this similar strategy as they went across North Africa and into Spain, Death to the infidel was the cry, but their success had as much to do with judicious tax policy as it did the sword or the Quran. And conquered people put up little resistance. They'd been taxed very heavily under the Romans, under the Byzantines, under the Sasanians. They were actually glad to be relieved and have this by these light taxing people. Burdens were so grievous, many of the rich and poor denied the faith of the Messiah. In other words, they said, we're not Christians. They were the largest body of converts, was Christians.
Yeah.
And there's a story about a Muslim army retreating from a large body of
Judea story,
of Roman troops. And as they evacuated, the chief tax collector of the Muslims reimbursed the conquered people's poll tax because the Muslims weren't able to ensure their safety.
Mm.
And the poll tax was nothing but the price of protection. Mm. And conquered Christians were brought to tears by the gesture, and they said, "May God bring you back to us." And I think eventually they did. But of course, as the Islamic Empire grew and prospered, it didn't last.
The story is old as time.
The stories, but actually, the fourth caliph, Ali, he had this great quote.
Yeah.
The proper upkeep of the land in cultivation is of greater importance than the collection of revenue, for revenue cannot be derived until the land is productive. In other words, don't tax them during hard times. And he had this whole thing of not taxing during hard times.
Yeah.
Help the economy grow, nurture the economy, and then the revenue will make its way to the exchequer.
That's like the Hong Kong policy in a lot of ways.
It's identical. And he was also insistent that non-Muslim people should not be humiliated. And so this went on, and again, it was very successful. And the early Islamic Empire was a place of great innovation, of great business, of great entrepreneurialism, advances in mathematics, advances in chemistry, advances in what's it called when you not alchemy? They were great alchemists. Alchemy was a legit,
and all these people, I believe.
Archimedes?
Was he Greek? I
think Archimedes was Greek, but I'm not sure he was an alchemist. But
I don't know if he was
the great philosophers, and they brought gunpowder to Europe, early gunpowder, and it was very different to the sort of imposing, restrictive Islam that many of us have in our minds today, in the context of the times.
Yeah.
But gradually, decadence crept in. And it wasn't a republic. There was like one caliph in charge and then lots of people under him. And everyone who was under him just, got their fingers in the till, basically. The very first caliph refunded to the state treasury the entire amount he'd drawn during his caliphate.
Yeah.
But by the 15th century, Islam's golden age was behind it, and higher taxes was the order of the day.
A story as old as time.
And there's a great story where there was the taxes in Egypt got so heavy that the caliph triggered a revolt when he tried to increase land taxes on the day one of his wives wore a 30,000 dinar dress.
And my favorite part was, and that was just one of his wives.
Yeah. Great stuff.
Oh, man.
And so we have this passage, which was this Ibn Khaldun, who's a famous
Ibn Khaldun, Tunisian guy,
Tunisian philosopher. And he said, in the early stages of an empire, taxes are light in their incidence, but fetch in large revenue. As time passes and kin succeed each other, they lose their tribal habits in favour of more civilised ones. Their needs and exigencies grow, owing to the luxury in which they've been brought up. Hence they impose fresh taxes on their subjects and sharply raise the rate of old taxes to increase their yield. But the effects on business of this rise in taxation make themselves felt, for businessmen are soon discouraged by the comparison of their profits with the burdens of their taxes. Consequently, production falls off, and with it, the yield of taxation.
Mm.
He might have been describing Rome or Greece before it.
That's classic
or
Rome.
Britain today, or even the US up until last month. So low taxation and small government accompany the ascent of great civilizations, and high taxation their demise. Initially, the Islamic armies brought liberation from taxation, but in time, they imposed it. The annual burden of 1 dinar became 4. Crop taxes became commonplace. There were many stories of taxes of taxpayers being humiliated. So, and there were people being double taxed. People used to tattoo their tax receipts onto their bodies in order to avoid being double taxed. And so, Khaldun was this great Islamic philosopher. And he observed that low rates bring in greater revenue, while higher rates bring in lower taxes.
He was the OG Arthur Laffer.
Exactly. And this was an observation made by David Hume, by Adam Smith, by Keynes made the same observation, JFK, Ronald Reagan. But and in fact, there's a great quote from 1924, your Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon. It seems difficult for some to understand that high rates of taxation do not necessarily mean large revenue to the government, and that more revenue may often be obtained by lower rates. The most famous of the lot was Arthur Laffer, and he drew what became known as the Laffer curve, and he was having lunch with Donald Rumsfeld, I want to say, and Dick Cheney. And he was having, two great beacons of something. And anyway, he was having lunch with them, and he drew this idea of this bell-shaped curve on a napkin. And the high point of the curve is the optimum taxation rate if you're trying to bring in revenue. It's the rate that generates you the most revenue. Once you go above that rate, revenue falls off.
Yeah, the incentive to.
And so that is the point that you obtain the maximum amount of feathers with the least possible hissing. To go back to that.
Well, it might be just the right amount of hissing.
Well, it depends. It depends whose side you are on this, because that's the point of maximum revenue for the government. But you might not think the point of maximum revenue to the government is necessarily a good thing.
Yeah, I agree.
But in any case, that became known as the Laffer curve, and it's since been disproved by left-wing economists. But I think it's one of those commonsensical things.
Well, I will say
we all know
it's still taught in the public education system. So at least when I was there, they still do teach you about Arthur Laffer and the Laffer curve. So
Okay, and JFK got it as well. It's a paradoxical truth that tax rates are too high today and tax revenues are too low, and the soundest way to raise the revenues in the long run is to cut the tax rates. But it's a lesson that we never seem to
remember.
Like, we have this new chancellor in the UK, Rachel Reeves, and we've unwisely, but for whatever reason, we've elected a left-wing government in the UK. We had the budget last November. She's put up tax after tax after tax, and the economy's fallen off a cliff. And so revenue has gone down with her high tax rates, and she can't understand why. And they're doing all this stuff. Britain is open for business. Don't tax them so much, and business will come to Britain quite naturally. And you don't need to go on Twitter and tell everyone how Britain's open for business.
This brings us to the greatest constitutional document of all time. Let's talk about it.
We can talk about that, and we can talk about the Rosetta Stone as well.
Oh yeah, let's do the Rosetta Stone,
which is
an interesting one.
In the British Museum, it's supposed to be the most valuable single item in the British Museum. The Elgin marbles might have something to say about that, but I guess there's more than one. But anyway, it's this ancient document written, or it's a fragment of a larger piece of stone written. It was discovered by Napoleon's armies in the city of Rashid, which was then called Rosetta, and it was confiscated, and somehow or other it made its way to the British Museum, as all things should. And but it's written in 3 different languages, and so it's incredibly important, and it's one of the oldest surviving written documents in the world, and we know it's supremely important because it was inscribed in stone. And it's written in 3 different languages. And so because of that, it's enabled us to understand ancient languages, which we otherwise wouldn't be able to do. But it was basically a tax document. It was a tax amnesty at the end of a war, and decreeing Ptolemy V has dedicated the temple's revenues in money and corn, has undertaken much outlay to bring Egypt into prosperity. And he forgives debts. It's basically a tax amnesty.
You called it a reflation plan. I've heard that term.
Have you not heard that?
No.
Well, the idea of a reflation plan is when there's no money in the economy, and so you find a way quantitative easing was a reflation plan,
okay.
but another way of reflating. You couldn't print gold and silver in those days, so the way to reflate was not to take taxes and leave the money in the economy and let the economy grow that way. And and they tax documents for obvious reasons are because it's the revenue of the government are usually really well kept, and so they make a great source for the historian. And again, historians will often find ancient tax documents, and that's where they learn a great deal about a society.
Fascinating.
So, the greatest constitutional document of all time.
This is my favorite tax. This is tax. They talk about this one on this channel. It made me laugh.
So we're in medieval England now, and we've talked about how leaders use a moral justification to impose a tax. And you even see it in the language of tax. Tax is your duty, your tribute, your due, all these kind of words. And often knights might not have wanted to follow their king to the Holy Land and participate in the crusades and more likely lose their life to it. And so the king very generously said that you don't have to come, but if you don't want to have to come, you have to pay scutage. You have to pay a tax instead.
Scutage, yeah.
Scutage, it was probably. Scutage. Scutage. And, but it was known as the cowardice tax.
I like that.
How about that guilt? I've paid the cowardice tax. I don't have to go to fight. And Saladin, the Islamic leader, destroyed the Crusaders, and the Crusaders needed to raise more funds, so they went back to the taxman, and they raised this thing. Henry II in England laid a special tithe called the Saladin tithe, and it was the greatest, one of the greatest taxes ever seen in this country. And you were given, if you were a knight going to fight, you were let off this thing, but it was a tax on arms, horses, garments, and appurtenance of whatever sort used by clerks. Everyone paid, and it raised something like it was the largest tax ever collected in England, and it wasn't popular. And the Archbishop of Canterbury had helped raise the money, and he disappeared to Wales for a year afterwards. And Henry II never made the crusade. He raised all this money with the Saladin tithe and never went to fight. He spent the money fighting with the French, and then he died a year later. And so Richard the Lionheart, now because his name's Lionheart, the English always think Richard the Lionheart was a great king.
Such a great name.
In the film with Kevin Costner, Richard the Lionheart was paid by Sean Connery, so everyone thinks Richard the Lionheart's a great guy. But in his 10-year reign, Richard the Lionheart spent less than 6 months in England, and he saw it as a place to be taxed rather than live in. And straight away, he raised another tithe, and then he went off to fight Saladin. I think he lost. On his way back, he was then kidnapped by the Holy Roman Empire.
Took him hostage.
Who demanded £100,000 of silver. Now, of course, a pound of silver was once the pound. That's where it derives. But it was a unit of account. There wasn't a coin that was a pound in weight. And it was the same amount that the Saladin tithe had raised the previous year, was then demanded in ransom. And of course, because it was the king, another tithe was raised to secure his release. And this time the clergy wasn't exempted, and they brought in a new land tax as well. And so Richard was eventually freed, and he went back and he went to France, didn't even come back to England.
So who took him?
The Holy Roman Emperor, which would be Germany.
Oh, Germany. Okay, yeah. Germany at the time.
And then Richard was succeeded by his brother John, who, funnily enough, had actually tried to bribe the Holy Roman Emperor to keep Richard for longer.
I'll give you 200,000 pounds of silver if you keep his ass.
So that he could become king. Oh, and King John was, of course, one of the most infamous tax collectors in history, gives us rise to Robin Hood and all those stories. And he just taxed and taxed and taxed. There were export duties. He raised cowardice tax 11 times in his 17-year reign. When I say raised it, I mean he imposed it 17 times.
He's one of my favorites. He's a nice, he was an entrepreneur too. I mean, he said, "Hey, I'm gonna sell the right for you to be a tax sheriff."
He was like, he would make USA
making
looks
money.
morally upright in comparison to King John. He did export duties. He imposed inheritance taxes. He sold sheriff.
That's what I was talking about. I love it.
Oh yeah, it's great. And then the sheriffs had to raise tax to pay off what they owed him for the sheriff.
Oh man,
I think that's where we get the Sheriff of Nottingham story from. And he also sold the rights to establish new towns, and the town of Liverpool, the city of Liverpool, was founded on one such right. Jewish people, not for the first time in their history, had a special tax imposed on them. They'd already been targeted in the Saladin tithe. They now had another tallage of 1210, and that left them £44,000 of silver worst off. He taxed widows who wished to remain single, even if they'd lost their husband in the Crusades. And then we got a shortage of, these things always seem to happen in tandem. We got a succession of poor harvests. So there was a shortage of food and rising prices. And we got
shocker,
a recoinage. He tried to stop the inflation with the recoinage, and that didn't work. And so the barons, who were kind of the next down in the hierarchy, had had enough. And they went to, they rose up against John, and they met him on the banks of the River Thames, a place called Runnymede. And the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langdon, brokered an agreement between the barons and the king. New taxes could only be levied with the consent of the barons. And this was the beginning of Parliament. Parliament stopping the king's power. Because we saw in the English Civil War, what got in the way of the king's revenue was the fact that Parliament was now in charge of collecting taxes. This began with the barons. Limits were placed on cowardice tax, on scutage, and other forms of feudal taxes. Barons were protected from illegal imprisonment. The church was also protected to an extent. And in exchange for this agreement, the barons agreed to vacate London. And both sides didn't keep their word.
Shocker.
Both sides went back on their word. It's always the way. This is the amazing thing about medieval times. Everyone went into an agreement expecting the other person not to keep their side of the deal. And so, the King John then went to the Pope, who declared the charter shameful, and he had all the rebel barons excommunicated, which was a big deal in those days. Excommunication was kind of like being cancelled today.
Yeah.
It was the cancel culture of its time. And the barons, meanwhile, didn't vacate London because they knew John was going to think. So they went to war again. And then John died in the war. But he didn't die because he lost a battle. He died of, I think he got dysentery, something like that. And so John's son was Henry III, but he was only 9. And we got a 9-year-old king. And he became under this protection of this chap called William the Marshal, William Marshal. The example of how your job becomes your surname. Marshal, a very common surname, but William the Marshal, William Marshal. And he was, according to the Archbishop, he was the best knight that had ever lived. And he was quite the character, this William Marshal. He'd served under 4 kings, and he was a loyalist. He was on King John's side, and he was still charging into battle at the age of 70.
Oh, wow. And
if you go to Kilkenny in Southern Ireland, you'll see this magnificent castle built by the same William Marshal. He was quite the most impressive man. And Marshal knew that he needed, with a 9-year-old king, there was essentially a power vacuum. He also knew that at the age of 70, his days were numbered.
Oh, yeah.
70 was an extraordinary age to have lived at that time.
Yeah.
And he wanted to ensure peace and stability for the 9-year-old monarch. And he was loyal to the crown, but he was also clever enough to see the damaging effects of all these taxes that they'd had. And so he decided that this charter that had been agreed between the barons and the kings was his best chance. So he got the failed charter made on the banks of the Thames 2 years previously, and he ignored criticism that he was being too generous to the barons. And he himself would be one of the witnessing barons, and it was called the Great Charter from which we get the name Magna Carta. And it's the sort of defining British document. Now, not only is it the defining British document, it is the defining American document. And again, Henry III reissued the charter in exchange for permission to levy taxes, and then Edward I did the same. So it just became part of our law. Mm-hmm. And there was a British judge, Lord Denning, he called it the greatest constitutional document ever made. That's where we got the expression that we began the chapter up. And if you actually look, I think there's like 2 clauses in the entire charter that remain as law. And like most of it was abandoned pretty soon afterwards. Mm-hmm. But the myth of what the charter meant lived on in people's minds. It's an iconic myth, a symbol of freedom, and it persisted throughout the English Civil War when it was argued that Magna Carta made the king subject to the law, that the king didn't have divine right.
It was a social contract between people and their government, essentially. I mean, it provided some, level of fairness there.
Sure. And it gave us trial by jury. It was important in the political thinking of the Glorious Revolution, which was, led to the sort of the beginning of Great Britain and the great beginning of central banking. Mm-hmm. But when the colonists set off for the New World, they had this mentality of that was instilled in them by Magna Carta. And, this was their rights. This was their fundamental rights. And so when they fought against their English overlords in the American War of Independence, they didn't believe they were fighting for new freedoms. They thought they were fighting for freedoms that
already existed.
Yeah. They were just fighting to retain what was theirs, and freedoms that were enshrined in Magna Carta. So this guy, William Marshall, who in resurrecting this document kind of gave us the American Constitution. It's all built around Magna Carta.
Oh, yeah.
So that's why it's just the most incredibly influential document, even though most of it is actually myth.
Yeah.
And lives on in our heads.
I think the Fifth Amendment of our Constitution.
And I think, the Fifth Amendment, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And that's one of the 3 clauses of Magna Carta that remained in English common law. And it's worded almost exactly the same if you read the Magna Carta with a little bit of medieval, oldie English thrown in. And FDR quoted it in his inauguration speech of 1941, and it was conceived some 700 years earlier in reaction to King John and his pernicious taxation. It shaped the national mentality of the United States. And even today, it's still a great part of this character, your nation's character. And, you are the most important country on earth. And this whole thing that's happening now with Musk and Trump, we keep calling back to it, what's going on. But it's all going back to the Constitution, which all goes back to Magna Carta and these silly taxes imposed by King John.